Ladies and gentlemen, the storm brewing around Steven Pinker's recent podcast appearance is not just about a single conversation. It's about the tension between power, knowledge, and the narratives that shape our understanding of race and society. When intellectuals flirt with ideas linked to race science, they risk legitimizing centuries of oppression disguised as data. Reason. We must ask who benefits from these debates and why certain voices are amplified over others. The backlash signals a deeper hunger for justice, truth, and accountability. The controversy surrounding Steven Pinker's podcast appearance and its association with race science brings to light an issue that runs much deeper than one conversation or one intellectual figure. It is a reflection of the way knowledge, power, and ideology intertwine to create narratives that can shape society for generations. When we speak of race science, we are not simply discussing academic inquiry, but the historical weight of pseudoscience that has been weaponized to justify inequality, colonization, and systemic discrimination. The backlash Pinker faces is not just personal criticism, but a collective response to a pattern of ideas that, even if not explicitly malicious, have long been used to enforce hierarchies of race and class. There is a responsibility that comes with being a public intellectual, especially one who commands attention in mainstream discourse. Words have consequences, particularly when they come from voices that are celebrated as rational, objective, or scientific. What makes the controversy particularly potent is how discussions like this often claim to be about reasoned debate, free speech, or the exploration of uncomfortable truths, but beneath the surface lies an implicit reinforcement of power structures that have historically oppressed, marginalized communities. Race science is not a neutral field of inquiry. Its roots are entangled with the ideologies that fueled slavery, eugenics, and apartheid. To engage with it, even indirectly, requires an extraordinary awareness of its historical and social implications. The problem arises when intellectuals dismiss the emotional and political realities attached to such ideas, treating them as if they exist in a vacuum of academic curiosity. Pinker's critics are not simply reacting to his words, but to the way such discussions can embolden harmful narratives that still impact the lives of millions today. This controversy also reflects a growing recognition of how power operates in knowledge production. Who gets to decide which ideas are worthy of debate? Who benefits from the framing of certain topics as controversial but permissible? When discussions about race science surface in high-profile platforms, they often fail to acknowledge that marginalized groups rarely have the same level of access or influence to counter these narratives. The very act of discussing these ideas, particularly by prominent intellectuals, can normalize them in the public mind, regardless of whether they are ultimately refuted. In this sense, the backlash against Pinker is less about silencing him and more about demanding accountability for the platforming of ideas that have caused real harm throughout history. We must also consider how this controversy speaks to the larger dynamics of modern media and public discourse. Podcasts and online platforms have become powerful spaces where complex topics are reduced to sound bites, stripped of nuance, and circulated widely to audiences who may not fully grasp the context. When someone like Pinker appears in such a setting, the weight of his reputation lends credibility to the content, even if he is not explicitly endorsing harmful ideas. This is why critics argue that the choice to engage with certain topics or individuals is never neutral. It is an exercise of power, deciding which conversations are elevated and which are ignored. In a time when misinformation spreads quickly and public understanding of science is often superficial, Intellectuals must be acutely aware of how their words can be co-opted or misinterpreted. The debate over race science is particularly charged because it is not simply about abstract theory, but about people's lived realities. For centuries, pseudo-scientific claims about racial differences have been used to justify exploitation, violence, and exclusion. Even today, traces of these ideas persist in policies, institutions, and cultural attitudes. When someone like Pinker engages with such topics, critics fear that the conversation could breathe new life into old prejudices, lending them a veneer of respectability through association with respected scholars. This is why the backlash is so intense, because for many, the stakes are not merely intellectual but existential. The very dignity and humanity of entire communities are on the line when these debates are revived without sufficient care. At the heart of the controversy is the question of intellectual responsibility. Freedom of speech is often invoked as a shield in these debates, but freedom of speech does not absolve one of the consequences of their words. Intellectuals have the privilege of shaping public understanding, and with that privilege comes a duty to ensure that their work does not perpetuate harm. Critics of Pinker argue that he has failed to fully grapple with this responsibility. That is willingness to engage with contentious ideas without acknowledging their historical baggage risks perpetuating the very inequalities he might claim to oppose. It is not enough to claim neutrality or objectivity when the topic itself is steeped in centuries of oppression. Another dimension of this controversy is the way in which discussions of race science often cloak themselves in the language of scientific inquiry. Science is a powerful tool, but it is not immune to bias. Throughout history, scientific claims have been manipulated to serve political and economic interests, often at the expense of marginalized groups. The mere invocation of science can lend an undeserved legitimacy to ideas that are fundamentally flawed or dangerous. This is why critics are wary of any association between respected intellectuals and the discourse of race science. It risks blurring the line between rigorous inquiry and ideological manipulation. When someone of Pinker's stature engages with these ideas, whether critically or not, it can be perceived as an endorsement, or at the very least, as a signal that such ideas are worthy of serious consideration. The controversy also reveals a deeper struggle over who controls the narrative of progress and reason. Pinker is often celebrated as an optimist who champions the power of reason, science, and humanism to improve the world. But when such optimism overlooks the lived experiences of marginalized groups or fails to address the structural inequalities that persist, it can appear tone deaf or even complicit. Critics argue that his approach to controversial topics like race science reflects a broader tendency among certain intellectuals to prioritize abstract ideals of free thought over the tangible realities of oppression. This tension between intellectual freedom and social responsibility lies at the heart of the current backlash. In examining this controversy, we must recognize that it is not about one man or one podcast appearance. It is part of a larger reckoning with how we discuss race, science, and power in the modern age. The public is increasingly unwilling to accept the old hierarchies of knowledge where a few privileged voices dictate the terms of debate while others are excluded or dismissed. The backlash against Pinker is a sign that people are demanding a more inclusive and accountable intellectual culture, one that does not shy away from difficult conversations but approaches them with the care and sensitivity they deserve. Intellectuals like Steven Pinker occupy a unique position of influence in public discourse. And with that influence comes an inescapable responsibility to consider how their words and actions shape societal understanding. The backlash against his podcast appearance highlights a crucial issue: the ways in which intellectuals, intentionally or not, can legitimize harmful narratives when they engage with topics like race science without critically dismantling the frameworks behind them. It is not merely about personal belief or intent. It is about the ripple effect of ideas when they are broadcast by those who command authority. Pinker's critics argue that even by entertaining discussions linked to race science, he contributes to a normalization of concepts that have historically been used to oppress marginalized communities, offering such narratives a platform they would otherwise struggle to find. The challenge lies in how public intellectuals navigate the boundary between open inquiry and responsible dialogue. There is a difference between fostering debate and inadvertently amplifying ideas that are rooted in pseudo-science and prejudice. In the case of race science, history is clear such narratives were constructed to justify slavery, segregation, and colonialism presented under the guise of scientific objectivity. Intellectuals who speak on these issues cannot treat them as abstract topics for exploration without acknowledging their profound social and political consequences. When figures like Pinker fail to directly confront the inherent dangers of these ideas, their audiences may perceive the discussion as an endorsement or at least as validation that these views merit serious consideration. This is where accountability becomes essential. Intellectuals must recognize that their words do not exist in isolation. They are amplified through books, podcasts, media appearances, and social networks, reaching millions of people who interpret them through their own biases and worldviews. A single sentence, taken out of context or framed in a particular way, can strengthen narratives that perpetuate racism and inequality. Pinker's defenders may argue that his role as a thinker is to challenge conventional wisdom and explore controversial topics. But this defense ignores the fact that some ideas are not controversial in a productive sense. They are harmful in ways that cannot be divorced from their history. The backlash also raises the question of what intellectual freedom truly means. Free speech and open dialogue are vital, but they are not without consequences. When an intellectual chooses to engage with race science or any similarly harmful narrative, they must ask who benefits from this conversation. Is the discussion challenging injustice, or is it providing cover for outdated and dangerous ideologies? Accountability does not mean censorship. It means understanding that public discourse is shaped not just by the content of what is said, but by who is saying it and how it is received. Intellectuals like Pinker, who hold significant cultural authority, bear a greater burden to ensure that their ideas do not cause harm. Part of the problem is that intellectuals often see themselves as detached observers of society, above the fray of politics or public emotion. But in reality, no one can truly be neutral when discussing issues like race, which are tied to centuries of violence and systemic discrimination. To discuss race science without acknowledging its destructive legacy is to ignore the lived experiences of those who have been dehumanized by it. This is why critics demand that figures like Pinker take a more active stance in rejecting these harmful frameworks, rather than merely debating their intellectual merit. Silence or neutrality in the face of injustice has never been neutral. It often reinforces the status quo. Moreover, public intellectuals must grapple with the ways their ideas are weaponized. Even if Pinker does not explicitly endorse race science, the mere act of engaging with it can give proponents of these ideas a sense of legitimacy. They can point to his participation as proof that their views are worthy of mainstream attention. This is especially dangerous in an era of fragmented media, where sound bites and headlines often overshadow nuance. A single podcast appearance can be clipped, shared, and misinterpreted by thousands, creating narratives that the original speaker never intended but is nonetheless responsible for. The demand for accountability does not come from a desire to silence intellectuals, but from the recognition that ideas have power. In the wrong hands, they can perpetuate harm. Pinker's critics argue that by failing to draw a clear moral line against race science, he risks being complicit in the perpetuation of racist ideologies. Accountability means being willing to confront the impact of one's words, even when the intent was to provoke thought rather than harm. It means recognizing that intellectual debates do not occur in a vacuum, but within a society marked by deep inequalities and historical wounds. This controversy also exposes a tension between the ideals of academic freedom and the demands of public discourse. In academic settings, it is common to explore even the most controversial ideas as part of rigorous inquiry. However, when these ideas are presented in the public sphere, the dynamics change. Audiences are larger, more diverse, and often less equipped to critically analyze complex arguments. Intellectuals like Pinker cannot assume that the general public will engage with their ideas in the same way that scholars do. Therefore, they must take extra care to frame their arguments in ways that prevent misinterpretation or harm. Furthermore, intellectuals who speak on sensitive topics have a responsibility to educate themselves thoroughly about the historical and social context of those issues. Critics argue that Pinker, while celebrated for his insights on language, psychology, and human progress, has shown a lack of awareness about the deep scars left by race science. This perceived lack of sensitivity fuels the backlash, as it suggests that he is treating a deeply painful and politically charged subject as an abstract thought experiment rather than a real and ongoing source of oppression. The backlash is also a reflection of a broader shift in how society views intellectual authority. In the past, public intellectuals were often seen as untouchable figures, their ideas accepted without much scrutiny. Today, however, the public is more critical and more aware of the power dynamics at play in public discourse. Audiences are increasingly unwilling to allow influential figures to speak without accountability, especially on issues that affect marginalized communities. This is not about silencing voices, but about ensuring that those voices are held to a standard of responsibility and ethical consideration. Accountability for intellectuals like Pinker also involves listening to the voices of those who have been historically silenced or ignored. Critics argue that instead of amplifying outdated or harmful ideas, public thinkers should use their platforms to elevate perspectives that challenge oppression and promote justice. This does not mean avoiding difficult conversations, but it does mean approaching them with humility and a willingness to learn from those who are directly affected by these issues. In this light, the backlash against Pinker can be seen as part of a larger cultural reckoning. It is not simply about one podcast appearance, but about the role of intellectuals in shaping the moral and ethical boundaries of society. People are demanding that influential thinkers move beyond abstract debates and take a stand against ideas that perpetuate harm. This expectation does not diminish intellectual freedom. Rather, it calls for a more thoughtful and responsible use of that freedom, one that acknowledges the real-world consequences of ideas. The backlash against Steven Pinker reflects a much larger shift in society's expectations for public discourse, where the demand for justice, truth, and responsible dialogue is growing louder with every controversy. People are no longer content to passively accept the words of intellectuals as untouchable or beyond critique. Instead, they are scrutinizing not just what is being said, but why it is being said and whose interests it serves. In the case of race science, this scrutiny becomes especially intense because of the long and painful history attached to it. Discussions of race science are not abstract debates in the eyes of those whose communities have been directly harmed by such narratives. They carry the weight of centuries of oppression, pseudo-scientific theories that justified slavery, colonization, and systemic racism. This is why the public reaction to Pinker's appearance is not about a single podcast. It is about the broader struggle for truth and accountability in a world where harmful ideas can spread faster than ever. The demand for justice in public conversations means that intellectuals can no longer hide behind the notion that they are merely presenting ideas or encouraging debate. Every platform, every word, and every association sends a message. When a prominent figure engages with topics that have been historically weaponized against marginalized groups, the audience wants to know whether that engagement is responsible, whether it challenges harmful assumptions or reinforces them. This growing expectation reflects a cultural shift where public dialogue is no longer judged only by its intellectual merit, but also by its ethical and social impact. Pinker's critics argue that his approach, whether intentionally or not, fails to fully confront the harm that such conversations can perpetuate. Truth itself has become a contested battleground in our time. We live in an era of misinformation where harmful ideas can be repackaged and disseminated under the guise of free speech or academic inquiry. People are becoming increasingly aware that ideas have consequences and that the public figures who promote or engage with these ideas bear responsibility for the way they are interpreted. When Pinker participates in discussions linked to race science, critics worry that his reputation as a rational and authoritative voice lends undue credibility to concepts that should have been discredited long ago. This fear is not unfounded. Throughout history, seemingly small endorsements of flawed ideas have given them new life, enabling them to seep back into public consciousness and influence policy, culture, and attitudes. The backlash also speaks to a deeper demand for responsible dialogue. People want intellectuals to engage with complex issues like race, but they expect these conversations to be conducted with care, empathy, and an awareness of historical context. The era of detached, abstract debates over human worth or racial hierarchies is over. Audiences now demand that public figures consider the real world implications of their words, particularly when those words intersect with issues of inequality and oppression. This does not mean avoiding difficult topics, but it does mean approaching them with a commitment to dismantling harmful narratives rather than appearing to legitimize them through casual discussion. Social media has amplified this demand for accountability. In the past, public intellectuals might have faced criticism within academic circles or specialized forums, but now every word they say is instantly accessible to millions of people worldwide. This increased visibility means that intellectuals cannot simply assume their ideas will be interpreted in the nuanced way they intended. Instead, they must grapple with the reality that their statements will be dissected, shared, and sometimes distorted by a global audience. The backlash against Pinker is not just about the content of his conversation. It is also about the context in which it was delivered and the perception it created. When the stakes involve deeply sensitive topics like race, even the perception of carelessness can provoke widespread outrage. Another factor driving the backlash is the collective awareness of systemic injustice. People are increasingly unwilling to tolerate narratives that seem to downplay or ignore the structural forces that shape inequality. Discussions of race science often focus on biological or genetic differences, but they fail to address the broader social, political, and economic systems that perpetuate racial disparities. Critics argue that by engaging with such topics without challenging these underlying structures, intellectuals like Pinker risk shifting the conversation away from the urgent need for systemic change and toward a misleading narrative of inherent difference. The public demand for justice is about redirecting these conversations toward solutions that confront inequality rather than inadvertently reinforcing it. The growing demand for responsible dialogue also reflects a rejection of the old hierarchies of knowledge. For too long, public discourse has been dominated by a small group of elite voices, while marginalized communities have been excluded from the conversation. The backlash against Pinker can be seen as a call to expand the scope of who gets to shape public narratives about race, science, and society. People are asking why certain voices are elevated while others, particularly those from communities directly affected by these issues, are ignored or dismissed. This shift represents a democratization of knowledge where the public expects intellectuals to not only share their ideas, but also to listen to and engage with perspectives beyond their own. There is also a moral dimension to this backlash that cannot be overlooked. The demand for truth is not just about factual accuracy, but about moral clarity. People want to know where intellectuals stand on issues that affect human dignity and justice. Neutrality or ambiguity in the face of harmful narratives is increasingly viewed as complicity. Critics argue that when figures like Pinker fail to take a clear stance against ideas rooted in racism, they leave room for those ideas to persist and gain traction. In a world where racial injustice continues to shape people's lives in tangible ways, this failure to speak out is seen as more than a personal oversight. It is a betrayal of the responsibility that comes with influence. The public's growing demand for justice and responsible dialogue also stems from a recognition of how interconnected our world has become. Harmful ideas do not stay confined to academic debates or niche forums. They spread across borders and platforms, influencing policies, fueling discrimination, and shaping societal attitudes. When intellectuals engage with controversial topics, the ripple effects of their words can reach far beyond what they might imagine. This is why the backlash against Pinker is so intense. It is not simply about one appearance, but about the broader impact of legitimizing harmful narratives in a world already struggling with divisions and inequalities. The controversy surrounding Pinker is a microcosm of a larger struggle to redefine the role of intellectuals in modern society. The public is demanding more than just sharp ideas or clever arguments. They are demanding integrity, empathy, and accountability. They want thinkers who not only challenge the status quo, but also do so in a way that uplifts and protects the dignity of all people. This expectation may feel burdensome to some intellectuals, but it is an essential part of ensuring that public discourse evolves in a direction that prioritizes justice and truth.